How many people have that?
It's very, very prevalent right now.
Is it really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, unfortunately it is, and I think it's compounded by a lot of the things that we do traditional medicine. But again, it's a neurological problem. It's not a physiological problem, and everybody treats it as a physiological problem because it hurts. And so you treat where it hurts. Unfortunately, that's not how to treat it. So you've got to treat the origin, and the origin is neurological.
Next email says, I've listened to most of your shows. I'm fascinated with all the stories of your results your system has been involved in. I've not heard anyone with a condition like mine. I'm unable to raise my arm off my side without excruciating pain. My doctor tells me I have a frozen shoulder and need surgery.
One of my favorite ones.
Frozen.
Oh, yeah, there is no such thing. There is absolutely no such thing as a frozen joint. I say that to doctors. I get their ire instantaneously when I say that. They get upset, they get in my face, and because what happens is, the muscle splints a joint, so it goes across the top of a joint like this, right? Mm-hmm. And what happens is when we have a frozen joint, the muscle is bound down so tight around that joint that it can't move, and the capsule gets irritated, so it can't move. So the answer is, get this, the answer is this. They put you under, the surgeon grabs a hold of your arm, jacks it up above your head, because you can't feel it. Because keep in mind, the only reason you can't move your arm is because it hurts like sin to move it. So you aren't going to move it, and you're not going to let a physical therapist, you're not going to let anybody move it because it hurts too much. Well, when you're under, you don't feel anything. So they jack your arm up above your head, and then they turn you over to physical therapy. Now, physical therapy has got to deal with the aftermath of that, and they get 16 visits to get your arm up. Now, guess exactly how far your arm usually gets after that. About 25 degrees. Okay, so when I'm dealing with a doctor and I said, that's impossible, there is no such thing. And so they get me a little riled up. And so all I do is relax that muscle. Just relax the muscle around the shoulder. Within 5 minutes, I'll have that arm straight up in the air at above 90 degrees. 5 minutes. And they look at me and say, well, that's impossible. See, you only believe what you know. You do not ever believe anything you don't know, even though you see it, which is absolutely astonishing to me because I've had orthopods sit right next to a patient. Their arm is straight up in the air, and the doctor says, that's impossible. How can you say it's impossible? You just saw it. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
It's nuts, but there's an age-old expression in medicine. We only believe what we know. We do not believe what we see. We only believe what we know because that filter's on there. It can't be. You can't do that. So to answer the guy's question, A, the shoulder is not the problem. B, we'll find the problem. Once we find the problem, we'll get his arm jacked up above his head with absolutely no pain. I've got a guy right in my clinic right now who's 67 years old who has never raised his arm above 25 degrees off the side of his, just like this, 25 degrees?
Off his side.
Off his side. Within 5 minutes, I had his arm straight up in the air. He was crying like a baby when I did that.
Well, that so-called frozen shoulder, is it generally the same problem every time?
Pretty much.
Right.
And guess what that would be?
What?
The same thing you had. If you kept that on and you kept going to all the other means of getting your golfer's elbow fixed, eventually you would get to the point where you had frozen shoulder.
Well, they told me, ice it.
That's logical.
Are you not a big believer in
ice? I do not
right?
use ice. Rest, ice, compression, and elevation is 200 years old. Do you know anybody in this audience, anybody, any doctor, anybody you know, drive a 200-year-old car?
No.
No. Why? Because it doesn't work. There's better technology out there. Our goal in as I've always told you, our goal in ARP is to replace rest, ice, compression, and elevation with ARP, Accelerated Recovery Performance.
You get this email all the time. How about arthritis? Can you work with arthritis?
Yeah, arthritis is a very intriguing aspect. I believe arthritis is unattended inflammation. Arthritis is kind of like a garbage catch-all for anything. If you're past the age of 50 years old, you got arthritis. Well, if you got any pain, you got arthritis. You have any issues in your joint, you got arthritis. Well, I used to think that arthritis was a age-related disease until I started working with the National Football League. 1 month in the National Football League, 1 month, you're equivalent to the same arthritis as an 80-year-old. 1 month. Now, what's the difference? The difference is, in the NFL, you're constantly absorbing force, and you can't get that force out. You're just constantly getting hit by a bus, okay? It takes you 60 years to get up to that point in normal lifespan. The bottom line is exactly the same. It's inability to absorb force and get rid of the inflammation. So once we get rid of the inflammation, the so-called arthritis symptoms are gone.
You also specialize in injury prevention.
Yes.
Part of your specials, we talked about them in the first segment, you're offering children and athletics who come into the clinic a free injury prevention evaluation. How do you evaluate that, and how do you prevent injuries?
Well, for anyone that's active out there, if you've got any children in any type of athletic event, I don't care if they're starting at pee-wees all the way up to college. Again, keep in mind, injury is not and should not be an expectation of athletics. It is now, but it shouldn't be. We have created a system by which we can identify who's at high risk for injury and basically prevent 60 to 80% of all muscle-related injuries by simply a test that takes 10 minutes. I'm teaching trainers all over the world how to do it, teaching NFL trainers how to do it, NBA trainers how to do it. And we have dramatically reduced the number of muscle-related injuries on the teams that we're affiliated with. The World Cup, as an example. The Dutch World Cup, they have 15 ARPs over there right now. We haven't had one injury. They're the only team that hasn't had a noticeable injury other than a kid prior to the World Cup.
ARPWaveClinic.com, 952-431-9708, ARPWaveClinic.com, 952-431-9708. They can get that one free evaluation to find out how it works for them.
Absolutely.
Dennis, thanks as always. We'll talk to you again next week.
Sounds great, Common.
That's the House of Pain, and once again, that's ARPWaveClinic.com, ARPWaveClinic.com, 952-431-9708. If you have a question for Dennis or want to find out more information, go to that website or call that phone number. That'll take care of it this week. We'll talk to you next Sunday right here on the House of Pain on KFAN, Minneapolis, St. Paul.
For more on ARPWave technology, visit arpwave.com. That's ARPwave.com.